Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the fourth webinar of Effective Workplace Communications, a short course presented by IT Masters on behalf of Charles Sturt University. My name is Guy Coward, and I'm your MC. And of course, the lecturer is Brenton. You might notice that I've changed my background, so feel free to have a chat about what I've changed, what your thoughts are on the change, things I could do to improve the background, given what we've talked about in the course so far. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we launch into some info on the exams and then we get talking with Brenton. Of course, we use Zoom still for our webinars and do so that we can encourage the asking of questions and the use of chat during the webinar. And you can chat with everyone by selecting, once you open the chat box, to send all your chat to all panelists and attendees. I really hope you get involved and help collaborate with everyone else. I might pinch the screen off you for now, Brenton. And I'll show you the course page, which is where you will find the exam. Hopefully you can all see that. Chuck us some notes in the chat, please. Yep, beauty. Thanks, Tim. Alrighty. So after the course, or after this webinar, in the next few days, we're going to be finalising the exam and finalising the Podoko situation that Brenton's working on. And it'll be really, and there's going to be a bit to say about that. First of all, the exam is going to be what is focusing on the webinar and the resources that we've had available to us throughout the course. The Podoko situation is just a little value add that Brenton's helped us out with, so we're really happy for that. But it won't be necessary to get to the exam. What will be necessary for the exam, though, is doing all of the weekly or module quizzes. So there's quizzes for each module that talk about the webinar and the resources for that module, and they are hurdle requirements. It doesn't matter how many times you take that test, you can keep on going and going until you get all 5 right. The pass mark is 3 for those, and all you need to do is give it a crack and pass it, and that will, once you do that for all of the modules, you can unlock the course exam, and we'll announce when that's up and running. So once we look at the exam, once you've done all of those quizzes, it'll be unlocked and it won't be in grey like this, it'll be in bold. And as it says, just make sure you really read it carefully. We'll probably do a little bit of a video chat about it as well. Essentially, it's a 40 multiple choice question quiz. It draws from all of the resources in the course, mostly the webinars, but if you want to excel in the exam, then you'll need to do a bit of the extra reading. And crucially, you'll only have 1 hour to make the attempt. And once you start it, it's impossible to stop the clock. So even if you have tech issues, just make sure first of all that you're prepared. Second, that you've got a solid block of time where you're confident you'll have net connection. If anything crazy happens, feel free to get in touch with us. It's not too hard to organize a reset if it's an open and shut case. So the pass mark is 50%. Only 1 attempt for the exams these days, and that's so that we can keep the exam open at all times. There's no sort of cut-off date, but we really strongly recommend that you do it pretty quickly after the last webinar, just so that it's all fresh, and you don't sort of put it to the side, and then say, oh, it's too late, I can't remember anything. So we'll go over this again at the end, and Brenton will talk more about the makeup of the exam. But hopefully there's not much that's unclear once you go through all of the materials. Okay, so I'll let you share your slides again, Brenton, and how you're going. We've been having a little bit of audio issues.
Hello, Guy.
G'day.
Thank you. I'm good, mate. Thank you very much. I'm still sharing my screen, it says.
Oh, good.
I think you just need to stop sharing yours, perhaps. Is that how it works? No? Share my screen? Oh, now I can share.
Wonderful.
All right.
Thank you.
Should we share the results of the poll just for a second? I'll put them up, just so everyone can see that. Now, we're going to go to the next level with a few things tonight. Some of it will be a little bit more advanced bits of it will be anchored to some of what we've already covered, and we'll take a few things a little bit further. We will specifically be talking about social media a little further. We will talk about personal branding. We will talk about influence. We will talk a little bit about video recordings, and I'm going to go into the broadcast element, not the live team chat that we talked about previously, but I'm talking about things like YouTube recordings, or not specifically for YouTube, but for any purpose that you might have for yourself or in the corporate environment. We'll talk a little bit about I'll talk a bit more about my environment here and elaborate a little bit on what's going on here. If any of you have perhaps spotted or seen the 1-minute intro video that has recently gone up for this particular course, some of you might recognize that the lighting is similar to what I used in that, and different to what I've been using for the last couple of weeks. We'll talk a little bit about that as well as we go through tonight. We'll do the usual format. We'll stop for questions at some point. We'll stop for even more questions at the end, so feel free to hang around and go through all of that. I have had a couple of audio issues. Me not hearing Guy is the issue. So Guy, if I don't hear you when you're talking, just pop your camera on and wave at me, because that is a second communications channel that we can tap into.
All right. And sometimes I'll just chime in and see how you go.
Yeah. And look, I heard you that time, and hopefully I'll hear you all the way through, but it has. I just want to answer a question that's just popped in. I just noticed the orange background. Why orange? It's corporate color. My company, Conperia, happens to use orange as it's the most educationally oriented color. And when we moved into this place, my wife said, look, why don't you just paint the back wall orange and make it the corporate color? And that was long before I ever thought of putting it on camera. So that's where it came from. That's why it's orange. It's a burnt orange, and that is the corporate color of my business, Conperia. And also the color we use with Produco. So that's the reason for the orange. And yes, it is meant to be a fairly learning, educational, instructional kind of color. All right, let's get rid of the poll. Let's start talking about Produco for a moment. Now, I think Guy's already mentioned that the exam will be up in a couple of days. And shortly after that, early next week, the scenario for Produco will also be up and available. So what Produco is an app. It's an app that I've built. It's still in beta, so it's very much a case of it's not yet perfect. It's something that we'd love to get your feedback on, but what we've put together is a scenario where when you join up, and you can download the app now and you can sign up and create an account, and in a couple of days you'll get an email saying with whatever address you signed up with, which is different from it could be different from the address you've used with IT Masters. But we'll send you an email saying the scenario is ready. Now, what is the scenario? It's a chat interface, and you are presented with incidents, things that have happened. And some of it is general, some of it is chat from an artificial or a fake team that you're working with, and you'll have to make some decisions. And there'll be some trade-offs, and there'll be scores that juggle these trade-offs. And the idea is not to have any one particular score go down too far. You don't have particular goals, and they're all meant to sort of go up, but it's always trade-offs. So if you've got something going up, a score that's going up a lot, and something that's going down, then maybe you've got a bias in your decision-making that is being revealed by this. So there's incidents, there's a couple of situations which are multi-stage incidents that take a few decisions to resolve. And there's some proactive things that you can do the proactive things are always good. They're things that will boost your score across in some way, net positive. But a lot of the incidents and a lot of the situations, some of them are a net negative, like it's bad no matter what you choose, and you've got to juggle it as you go. There's also some micro lectures, which are 60 seconds or less, which are meant to give you things to think about that are taken from this course. So won't go over it in any more detail than that. If it's something that you'd like to join in and have a go at, please do. You'll get that email in a few days. And after that, there'll be a survey that will send us 10 questions or something that would be really valuable to me, because we're hoping to use this for more of these sorts of courses, and even for the university courses themselves. So moving on from that, let's have a bit more of a talk about social media and where we're going with this conversation. Now, some of these things, you already know about what it means. We're all very familiar with what Facebook is. Some of us are active on it. Some of us are not. Some of us are using it. Some of us look at it but don't post. it's something that's evolving fairly rapidly. And it began as a way of expressing and putting ideas out, putting ourselves out there. It has so many other ways in which we interact with it. It creates connectivity between us. It's a way, for example, I found out about a high school reunion that I would never have been able to hear about if it wasn't for things like this. I'm connected to people that I otherwise would have no way of getting in touch with easily or keeping in touch with. So this is a vehicle that is very much more available for the emotional vector. So if you think about the three vectors of change, the intellectual, the emotional, motivational, a lot of it is surface intellectual, the things we skim through, knowing about other people. But the things we learn about the people that matter to us, they shift our emotional vectors more. So it's very good. These kinds of social media formats are very good at shifting both the intellectual and the emotional vector, but they're not so good at the motivational. So it's not something that we are likely to take action on necessarily. They top up our feelings and they ease our boredom. But one of the biggest things that we're all sort of starting to become aware of is that what we do put out there, we generally don't own it anymore. Or even if we do, or even if they say we do, we don't have a lot of control over it. So intellectual property is something that we kind of know a bit about. We know a bit about copyright, etc. But when it comes to any kind of social media, what we put up is controlled by the agreement we've reached with the infrastructure, the network that we put it on. And often we'll find that we don't have all of the rights that we might have assumed we had. But even when we have the rights, what we think we have the rights to is often unenforceable and unprotectable. Because once we've done something, changing it is often extremely difficult. And just looking at it from a practical point of view, if we post something and then we change that post, what we can't prevent is that somebody somewhere has already seen that, already recorded it, already taken a screenshot, already have that information as it was then. Now, we might say, well, we're only going to share things with certain people, but those certain people might then share it with somebody else. And we might decide that we're going to set certain security, privacy, sharing settings, but then the terms and conditions that we are agreeing to might change in the future. And what we agreed to before might not be the same as it was in the future. So it's a muddy environment. And there's some rules and some traps that we all really should keep in mind whenever we put anything online. The kinds of social media that we work with, and we'll talk a bit about in a moment, the professional media, but it's this quasi comparison between, is it a form of communication or is it a form of expression? Most social media are a form of expression. And when we read things, especially on Twitter or short form medias, Instagram, Snapchat, we're often capturing someone's momentary thought or momentary feeling. And we might align with that or we might react to that. But it's mostly still the expressional elements that we are responding to. Now, Marshall McLuhan was famous for many things, but one of the quotes that he said was, you know, the medium is the message. But one of his more relevant quotes when it comes to social media, and he invented or he conceived of social media decades ago. Some of his famous quotes were, "The year I was born." That's the idea of how long ago some of this was. But one of the things he said is that we become what we behold. We shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. And when it comes to social media, we've built this. We build social media, we build our networks, but yet day by day, we are influenced by what we are exposed to in those networks and how we connect with them and how we interact. Now, when it comes to professional networks, this is a different kind of environment, but we are still human. So we still follow the certain rules. And those of you who remember when LinkedIn began, it began very much as an entrepreneurial promotional environment. It began as a way of finding other entrepreneurs, finding other skilled or clever people. It became something where discussions and forums and groups were trying to share clever and interesting ideas. And it also continually evolved as a marketing tool, a personal marketing tool. And it's reached a stage now where any busy professional in various markets around the world or in certain countries around the world, you're not going to get very far without a LinkedIn profile, because that is something of a de facto resume environment. So within that sort of professional environment, these groups create opportunities for discussion within a professional mindset and a professional paradigm, but within a certain topic. So an industry, a profession, and something that's meant to be sharing ideas. Now, today, there are a lot of people who are resharing ideas. So there's a difference between authors who write in material and post it, and authors or influencers who simply find it, read it, and then share it and repost it. Now, reposting is considered now to be a very valuable thing, because we don't want to be looking at all of the available posts. But if we find someone that is thinking and finding about the same things that we do, if we find a like mind that is sharing stuff of interest, we might follow that person, because we're literally tapping into their research, their interests, and what they want to share. But to become that person, if we are that person, someone who's sharing information, then we become someone who is literally shaping the thoughts of what others in our industry or in our like space are actually thinking about. Now, the forum environment is the place where ideas are meant to be debated. It's meant to be back and forth. You guys have a forum, then you've been using it in this way with this particular short course. So there's been discussion, debate, back and forwards between different people. And that's the way a forum is meant to work. There's no right or wrong answer. It's not meant to be, here's a result. But when it comes to the original role that many of us adopted LinkedIn for, a lot of HR and professionals, and if there are any HR professionals in the audience today, make a comment about this and share your thoughts, yes or no, in the chat. But a lot of HR are using social media just as much as professional media to try to learn things about candidates. It's not enough to say, well, what have you got on LinkedIn? Because we all know that LinkedIn is a little bit of a brag sheet, and it can contain a little bit of mutual gratification, and it can include a lot of things that aren't always entirely factual. It's difficult to verify. But often in social media, what we say, because we lack the same filter, what we say there is a more honest representation of ourselves. So a lot of HR is, and not just HR, but if it's working in a HR, if that's how HR is doing it because of the commercial benefit, what's everyone else doing? Is everyone else just looking at our LinkedIn and saying, right, that's him, that's her, that's that person, I know that? Or are they saying, well, hang on, what about everything else that this person is online? Maybe I could learn some more. Maybe I could learn about some other sites, some other networks that they're part of. And there are many, and there are a growing number, obviously. So a bottom line that I would like everyone to remember, and I think most of you know this, but it works, it's worth repeating. Anything that we put online, it's permanent. Even when we delete it, it's out there somewhere on a search engine, on a Wayback Machine, in somebody's archive. It's still there somewhere. It's public. Even when we lock it down and say, only these people can see it, we can't stop them from sharing it with someone else. It's effectively public. It's unretractable. We can't delete it. You might delete what's there in that profile, but that doesn't mean you've deleted all of the other sources and all the other backups and where it's gone. You can't protect it. You can't control what happens to it after that. You can put some limitations around it. You can try, but you don't have control. You no longer are fully in charge of it. That's everything we put online. And everything we put online contributes to our personal brand and our ability to influence.
Interesting. So, Brenton, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. If we can go back to that slide, there's some interesting stuff in the chat and the Q&A.
Yep.
First of all, we've had some people talking about people marketing directly through LinkedIn. So
yes.
perhaps it's a platform that's evolving. And Mark is even wondering whether LinkedIn is actually considered a social media and still operating in the emotional realm other than the intellectual.
I think it's becoming that. I think that's a direction that it's going in, but it's a narrower range of emotions. It's not trying to trigger emotional response on as broad a range of issues as you would find in Facebook, for example. But it's certainly trying to trigger a much more commercial, much more professional response range. But yes, I do think so. If you look through what LinkedIn is offering now, and it's so much easier now to pop a video in your feed, and people are promoting their interests, their ideas, what matters to them. But there's always a slightly more professional twist to that. So yeah, I do think though that it's certainly pushing more and more into the emotional vector, because you've got to get through all three vectors to have a result. So if people want to use LinkedIn to get results, they have to move their audience through all three vectors. And if LinkedIn wants to be a platform that people use more effectively, then they're going to facilitate that. So absolutely, I think that that's a thing that's happening, and happening quite significantly.
Interesting. Chris is a big fan of the phrase like space and wonders whether you coined it. He thinks it's a fantastic description of the social media echo chamber.
It literally popped in there just then. So
to be in your brain.
It wasn't scripted. It just popped in there. And I guess it works. I like it. It's the like space. It's, I guess you can read it a number of different ways. So yeah.
There's a couple of people who have got jobs through LinkedIn, and there's an interesting case where I'm just looking for it now in the chat. Rebecca interviewed 50 people, and now we'll be checking out the LinkedIn profiles of the top candidates. I wonder whether it's the opposite case of some people. You check the candidates before the interviewing, and then there's also an interesting question for HR people from Ashley in the chat. How do you consider or view people who have a minimal online presence? Is that in itself a statement?
So in my view, it can be, but it's not necessarily a poor statement. It's not necessarily a negative statement. And it really does depend upon in what way that you're trying to assess that person. If you're looking for someone whom you really do need to be more connected and more involved in an online environment, depending on the role, depending on what you're looking for from them, it's going to factor in even more. But if you're not, and that's not what they're meant to be doing, then that might narrow down where you get your information from. And that in and of itself might make you less informed about that person. And you might need to spend the time to get that information through other means. And that might mean that they fall off the shortlist, potentially. That's in pure practical terms. You need to be sufficiently educated. And if you might decide, look, I just got too many people to look at. I'm only going to look at the ones that I can learn. It's the same principle as when someone gives you, back when it was only resumes, you'd get short resumes and long resumes. And the resumes that didn't tell you enough would go to the bottom of the pile. And you'd work through the resumes first that told you enough. And if that was enough for you to find a candidate, then the other ones might not have gotten anywhere. And so the art of resume writing became a thing. And this is just an adjunct to that process. So we would all have something to gain in the same way that we'd have to gain by having a more complete, more effective resume. But it doesn't mean it's a make or break depending on the role.
Cool, thanks a lot. Let's keep going.
Let's talk about social circles, because this is the psychological phenomenon to do with how we connect. And this is where a lot of networks are changing the way they do things. Remember the early days of Facebook, you only had one option, friend or not friend. And a lot of organizations now are recognizing the fact that humans don't work that way. We have circles that are of different levels of proximity to us and to our lives. And the ability to work in social dynamics within certain distances from us is an important thing. And it's based on the idea of social circles. So we find the social networking that has the mass contact is starting to work within circle-based networking. And this fits and aligns with the way we think of our own network. We have people that are very close friends, usually only a handful, a couple or a few. Then we have a larger group of friends, and then we have a group of acquaintances, and then we have people we know through certain channels. And linking between those is often challenging. We often like to keep them separate. We might have a good time with our colleagues, but we might not bring them together with our childhood friends that we still, it's a different environment. So there's a recognition now that social interaction has very much a circular and a pronged approach. And this is the way humans interact. And if we're talking about having an online presence or a personal brand, we need to be aware that different people, depending on where they fit in our circles and where we fit in their circles, are going to perceive us differently. They're going to look at us differently. They're going to respond to us differently. And knowing where we connect to them and where they connect to us is helpful if it's important in how we connect to them. So our personal brand is either something that we've put effort into, it's either something we've crafted and it's a deliberate outward projection of what we want others to see. It's either that, or it's just what everyone has assumed based on what they've been able to find. And that may not be the right story. It may not be what we want them to see. So the elements of a personal brand, what is it? Well, some things that describe a personal brand, it's relatively narrow. It's absolutely not all of us. It is only a small bit of who we are and what our information contains. And it's just that little bit that's usually available online. So it's a sliver. And what we know about most people that we know about online, we only know a sliver about them and their lives and their reality. It's never quite correct. It's always based on subjective judgments. It's always based on opinions. It's always based on the filters through which that information, that narrow little bit of information, is absorbed by the recipient. So it's subjective in all ways and at all times. It's often preconceived. So people will bring a judgment to what little information they can get about you, and they will bring their pre-existing mindset to that. That's human nature. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about, right? So up here, I have some academic, my master's and grad certs, etc. Now, when you all saw that, some of you reacted and thought, wow, this Brenton's obviously done some stuff. He's got some qualifications. Maybe he knows a thing or two. And some of you would have had a very different reaction, looked at that and thought, oh, what a pretentious bloke. He's sticking his things up there to show off and pretend that he knows lots of stuff. I'm not able to control which reaction you had. So I have to be able to decide, well, which is the trade-offs? Which am I going to get a greater degree of impact? Which am I going to have more contextual relevance from? Do I put them there? Do I not? So that's an example, though, of the fact that no matter what you say or what you present about yourselves, you're going to get it interpreted differently by different people. And whatever is missing, whatever they can't decide, they'll fill gaps with assumptions. So when you look at something like this environment that you see here, some of you will look at the size of the room and will make assumptions about my lifestyle, how I live, where I live, and what sort of environment. And you will be able to subconsciously extrapolate a whole bunch of answers to questions that you didn't even ask yourself. But that's the way the human mind will work. And every other aspect of everything that you see in front of me, you will make a series of assumptions about and extrapolate that, because humans want to have a bigger picture. We want to fill in the gaps. And whatever we've got together, whatever it all is and what it adds up to, that's what we're going to use to judge that person. So everything that's here, everything that's in the room, everything I've said, everything that I do is all combined to form a judgment from you of who and what I am. And ultimately, the final question that everyone's looking to answer is, what value is that person to me? And that then leads to the question of, well, how much should I be influenced by that person? So here's some takeaway lines with personal branding. You are the first impression that you make. It's a real thing. It lasts. First impressions go on. And I just want to say at the end of this slide, we might grab some questions. So if you've got any and you think of any, now's a good time to put a couple up there. You are the first impression that you make, because after that, I'm going to go back a step, right? So after that, a first impression becomes one of these, a preconceived ideas. It has spawned a whole heap of assumptions, and they will persist and they will be hard to change. And all of that begins with the first impression. Now, if someone does a Google search about you and that's all they know about you, that's what you are. That is what you are. You might be more, and part of their mind might be saying, yeah, there's more to this person than that, but that's all they know. So they're going to judge you based on that. Now, if you're someone like my wife, who is fortunate to have a very odd name, she has she has an Indian first name. Her first name is Rani, and her surname is, of course, Birchmore. And that's an odd, unusual name. It's very rare. And if you Google search that, she's the first 8 pages you come across. So that means that everything you see there is going to be the sum total of what you know and think and believe about that person. You are your LinkedIn page. Well, you'd also say you are your Facebook page and your Snapchat and your Twitter account and your whatever else that you're running. But whatever is there, because that's the expression. We talked about that a moment ago, right? That's the vehicle for expression. And what you express is a window into the inner workings of your heart and mind. So, but how you said it is not always how it's interpreted, but it's what they interpret about what you've said that's going to be who you are. That's who you are. And it might not be, and you might say, no, that's not me really, but it doesn't matter, because that you is what they've made their decision on. That's what they've based their answer on. You are what others say you are. So we'll talk about influence in a moment, and we'll talk about the informational influence. When we get advice, referrals, references. Do you know this Brenton guy? What's he like? Oh, well, yeah, he's a bit like this and he's a bit like that. That's who I am. Why? Because that's all you've got to work with. That's my personal brand as translated by someone who judged and viewed me through their own filters. Now, if it's positive, it's very powerful. But if it's not, it's very powerful. You are what others assume you are. So all this information that they've gotten, whatever's missing, they'll make assumptions and they'll fill in the gaps, and that's the rest. And all of that stuff, they'll forget some of it. It won't linger in their minds. They'll forget what you did. They'll forget, how many of you can even remember what these degrees were? Did you even hear it the first time? Maybe not. That's an example of something that if you ask you again in a year's time, what was Brenton's qualifications? You're not going to remember. You are what others remember about you. And of course, we know how memory works: repetition, reinforcement. If I'm not reinforcing certain pieces of information about myself, you will not remember those. And therefore, they will fade out of their relevance in how you judge my personal brand. So we're going to have one question. I'll do one more slide then. In order to create your personal brand, you need to define and understand for yourself who and what you are in an online space. You need to make your decisions. Know what a brand is, know what you want to be, know how you want to express yourself. Make a decision. If it's all subconscious, then a stream of consciousness kind of output, then yeah, it's real, but it's uncontrolled. It's not going to be an instrument that you're able to use to create specific influence. But you need to be the real you. We're not talking about putting on a performance. We're not talking about acting and pretending. Lots of influencers do, but the idea with a personal brand is that it needs to be a reflection of who you really are. But you're highlighting the elements of yourself that you want others to remember most. But it's very much a case of what I do, not what I say. So actions, whatever our actions are, however we behave, however we conduct ourselves, needs to match the words. We need to be consistent. The repetition, that's the memory element. If we're consistent in how we conduct ourselves online, in how we respond, in the kinds of language that we use, in the way we express ourselves, if the way we communicate is consistent, if the kinds of things we discuss are consistent, if the things that where we come from, the perspectives we bring, then that will be remembered. We can establish it as a norm and a pattern, and then it becomes part of our personal brand. It becomes part of what people believe us to be. Now, before all of the digital stuff, one last point, before all of the digital stuff, obviously, we would do all this in the workplace. We do this in the canteen. We do this by the water cooler. We do this in the meetings. We do this in the coffee shop. We do this at the lunch. This is where we would establish our personal brand. But with the digital environment, not only are we expected to reach beyond the direct face-to-face, but if we do, and we do it successfully, we can have an enormous influence in the world around us. Now, I mentioned a while ago that my wife is fairly busy in the corporate, in the online space. Well, in her LinkedIn account, she has over 5,000 followers. And that's people that are looking for what she's going to say next, but she doesn't write these articles. She just forwards and points them out, and has accumulated 5,000 people that are wanting to see what she's going to point out next, because she's trying to relate it to the others of that similar interest. If she's not consistent with the messages and what she's sending out, those followers, those people who are listening, will lose their interest, because she's not relating to them on a consistent basis. She's not being true to the brand that she's established.
What if she wants to change her brand?
Well, the simplest way to change brands is to change platforms. That's the brute force method, right? So, and this is why you have situations like a lot of the gamer influencers will shift from Twitch, for example, onto YouTube or back and forwards. And as you get more and more platforms, you find that people will shift and not all of their followers will move with them. Changing brand is something that if you do it quickly and suddenly and jarringly, you will lose a lot of the people that you might have otherwise been able to bring with you on the journey. Often changing brand is about being open about it and saying, you know, my position is evolving, I'm thinking differently, or simply subtly talking about different things. But doing it gradually is the only simple answer to that question.
Okay. We haven't got too many questions. So I've
okay.
gone ahead and looked at your LinkedIn page and my LinkedIn page. And I was wondering whether you want to go through them and have a look at them and talk about them with reference to this. Or whether we can just go through more stuff and have some questions later.
We can do that at the end. If we don't get any more questions at the end, let's do that. Because I think that we've got too many other things to go through in the next 20 minutes or so. So
yeah, cool.
But that's a good idea. Let's come back to that if that's a thing. Is there any questions that we can answer?
Yeah, absolutely. And someone who's come every week, which is wonderful. Thank you, Anne. Facebook, Instagram are more and more used by social influencers, in turn professionally as well as just a personal circle. So is it wise to keep the professional connections out and maybe have like different accounts, all these sorts of things?
So keeping the professional connections out, I mean, if you need to decide what your personal brand will be in any network. So if you're talking about Instagram, what is Instagram used for you? And if you're saying it's friends and family, then you don't connect and invite and associate with non-friend professionals in that environment. You wouldn't do that. Similarly with LinkedIn, you might say, well, this is for all my professional contacts. And yes, some of my friends I'm connected there, but you know, aunts and uncles that aren't necessarily in any way related to me professionally, maybe I wouldn't connect with them on LinkedIn. So my point is, for each network that you're in, decide what your personal brand is going to be. And is it going to be of a professional leaning or of a personal leaning? Or is it going to be a deliberate blending of the two and you want to mix it? Just make the decision consciously, but then know that that's where you've gone in that direction. So I think a good example of a blended platform would be Twitter, because it's not something that you definitely control who follows you, but you can control who follows you to an extent. But Twitter is something where it's sort of random stream of consciousness. And so knowing that that's that kind of platform, you would probably make sure that you're saying something that's sufficiently neutral or sufficiently honest to you that it can be managed by either audience. But Facebook, you might just put your social contacts. LinkedIn, you might just put your professional contacts, for example. So the platforms will get cleverer about how to differentiate that. And you'll have eventually you'll have things that you can decide which circle you want to have visible to that.
Fabrizio asks, what can you do for your brand if people badmouth you?
So the first thing you could do is try to understand how and why it happened. And this is one of the reasons why I went through those points earlier, because you could look through that and say, well, not worry about the emotional element. Look at the functional element. Which piece of this puzzle or pieces didn't work out with this person? Now, you might find that you did or said something that pushed the emotional vector for them in a way that created a severe reaction. And maybe they are influential, and then they have created a cascading effect. So knowing that that's how the mechanics work, you say, well, I only triggered one person, but then they then triggered another, however many. So then you say, well, is that a problem I need to solve? If it is, maybe you say, well, there is a group of people who I have as an audience who I need to be aware of, that I don't cross those boundaries. I don't shift their emotional vector that far. And maybe you'll restrain some of the things that you put out there. Or maybe that it's not something you've said, it's something you've done, and you can't undo it. You can't unsay it. So the first step is forward-based correctioning. You can't go back and fix it. You can't go back and say, oh, I'm going to delete. Well, you can go and delete text, but backfilling is often, just as often, going to make the problem worse, because it'll be viewed as trying to rewrite history. Most often, the path forward is to make it a learning observation and say, I've learned from this. I didn't like how it worked out. I'm going to handle things differently. It doesn't mean that you're being under the control of the influence of the people you've influenced, but it's a way of saying, well, I'm in control of my personal brand. And I saw that, I take that as feedback, and I'm adapting to that. And it's trying to have the most mature, responsible approach you can is usually the advice.
Beauty. Maybe one last question. Jesper asks, what do you think about people who use their titles in LinkedIn compared to those people who use something that describes themselves? And I wonder now whether it's an interesting time to talk about the second poll, or maybe we can keep that over.
Let's save the poll a little bit, but it's a good point. I think that it doesn't necessarily matter. I think that's a nuance that, and what I'm going to say there is Jesper's got a good example of where that's the thing that's an important enough factor to Jesper. Like what Jesper would make that decision is an important decision. And Jesper saying, well, that's an important decision that other people are making. What does it mean? And it's not always important to everyone else. And it doesn't mean that they are a particular kind of person. It doesn't mean that they have a particular kind of agenda. It means that they're just trying to make best use of the platform to put information in a way that they think is going to have the right result. So we are naturally inclined to ascribe greater meaning to things that mean something to us. If it's important to us, we'll assume it's important to them, and we'll wonder why that's really important. So my answer is that not everything that we see in those moments are necessarily as important as we feel they should be. And maybe we could look at it from a more neutral perspective and say, well, let's give the benefit of the doubt. Let's take a step back and say, well, maybe that's not as important.
Alrighty, let's keep going. Thanks.
So types of influence, let's go through some of them briefly. Informative influence is when people don't know enough and they ask for advice. This is the referral question. Hey, what do you think of so-and-so? Should we use them for this work? Or where we don't know enough to make a decision or a judgment, so we look up reviews. So should we stay at this hotel? Let's read the reviews. Should we download this app? Let's read the reviews. Now, that's just information, but we're taking that information and we're using it to influence us. Now, some of you will use that same information in different ways. Some of you will just look at the stars. How many stars? Yep, that reaches my threshold, I'm in. Some of you will say, well, let's see what the happy people said. Some of you will say, well, no, the happy people are the ones that just got lucky. I want to read what the one-star people say, because they're the ones that are going to tell me what might happen. And so we all have a different approach, but the informative influence means that all of that still influences us. And ultimately, it influences where our money goes. The normative stuff is where we're influenced with the need to fit in. And this happens in the workplace. This is where there is a need to not stand out too much. And sometimes we still like to stand out a little bit, but there's limits to how far we can stand out. And so there's a degree of influence where simply because others do it a certain way, there's a pressure upon others to follow suit and fit in. But you have conformity in a couple of different ways. You can have a public conformity. This is where you say, well, publicly, I'm going to behave like this. So when I'm at the office, I will behave a certain way because that's how I'm expected to behave. But privately, I think they're all idiots. You know, I think I can't stand this lot. I put on a happy face, but frankly, I don't fit here. I don't like the way how things happen. That's an extreme example, but that's public conformity. We are conforming in public. Private conformity is when we really do believe that. We really do agree. We take on their ideas, their way of doing things, their thoughts, and we make it our own. So it's conforming within ourselves, not just as a public appearance, as an external factor. And this is because we bring it into a part of our identity. So we are influenced because we want to be that. We want to be the person that is that thinks like that acts like that behaves like that. And humans have been doing this forever, following role models. And even those of us that say, oh, I don't have any role models, you know, like, but we're still influenced by people that we're impressed with, however subtly. Natural human behavior. We want to be a little bit more like that person because we were impressed by them. Then you've got the compliance and obedience factors, which is all about consequence. That's all about the external factor. Yes, I'm going to wear this sort of clothing because it's the dress code of the office, and if I don't wear it, I might lose my job. And that's a simplistic example, but there's many things where we interact differently with people who we believe have a higher level of authority over us. And it's not just absolute authority. It's implied authority. It's the fact that they have some power over us. And we have this factor even in online influencers where people are making comments, but they won't necessarily make some comments, because if that influencer responds and criticizes them or shames them or responds to them, then they might suffer a consequence. So they might constrain their comments, their own feedback, etc., in order to not suffer. And we see this happen in the world around us all the time. So getting influence in an online space, we need to have a clear, concise message. We need to know what it is we're trying to get across. We need to know what it is that we want to influence others. But that influence needs to add value to them. We need to be in some way adding to their lives, to their understanding, adding to, or trying to add something that we hope that they will find of value. Because when they value something, if they value us as a person, and they respect us as a person, we will have influence. And we add value because we are an example to them that they aspire to in some way. Or if we give them knowledge and information, if we help them make a decision, if we help them fit in, we are influencing them, but we're influencing them in a way that they value. Now, if we want to do this more often, get more exposure, do more stuff, post on LinkedIn. All my wife did is start referring other people's posts. That's how it started. And it just cascaded from there. She never set out to do any of this sort of thing. And a lot of people don't set out to be influential. It's just about being heard. But we might also refer to other people who have influence. Point out, refer to, bring into the conversation other people who are influential. And we are then seen to be like them. We are associated with them. We are connected to them. Try not to make that connection too tenuous, but there is power for us when we can show a relationship with other forms of other sources of power. But if we start a conversation, it's more powerful than joining in one. And if we start a conversation that goes nowhere, no one's really going to remember. Remember that post that Brenton wrote a couple of years ago and nobody replied? Nobody remembers that. They don't remember the 50 posts that I might have written that nobody replied to. But what they'll remember is the one that has 1,000 replies. Brenton's pretty influential. Look, he's got 1,000 replies on this post. Simply because lots of things that didn't happen. It's just an example. But simply because...
Yeah, hopefully you don't remember the ones where no one replied. And I was like, oh, I'm so lonely.
But I feel it, right? And I think, oh, I hope someone replies. But I need to let go of that feeling, because when it comes to influence, it doesn't matter. I don't need to influence with everything I do. But if I do enough of it, influence will happen. And when I say influence, I mean, my passion is education. I'm passionate about educating. So my influence is offering possibilities, offering ideas, offering something that hopefully someone will say, yeah, that could be right. That could be interesting. And hopefully they'll take that and make use of it. But when conversations become trending, when things happen, then if you want to have influence, be part of it. Have a comment, join in, be on the bandwagon, because even though that can be a little bit corny, yeah, look, you know, join the bandwagon, etc. But it's usually better than watching it go past without you. And occasionally ask for feedback, which is exactly what I'm going to do with the poll. What we're going to do with the poll that's going to happen in a little while. Why don't we do the poll now?
Right, yeah.
See if anyone's got any questions. We'll talk about professional.
Okay.
So this is a
number 2.
This is a poll for IT masters and for myself. So this is an example of reaching out to you as an audience and saying, well, what do you find interesting? There's a format here. And the format is that, you know, there's a talking box, there's some content, there's some webinars, and there's, you know, talking heads saying stuff. There's lots of written, there's pre-recorded, but that formula takes the personality out of the equation. So this kind of is an example of the kind of feedback that says, well, what extra elements are of interest to you as an audience? So if you are reaching out to an audience and you're posting, you're communicating, you're sharing, occasionally share a question. Depending on the format, you might not do a survey. You might do one question. What do people think about this? What should I change in my room? If I was doing YouTube videos and broadcasting, which might happen one day, I might have a question in the, I said, well, tell me one thing I should change in my room here. And people will advise, and people will want to contribute. They'll want to give you feedback. Because if you've influenced them, they will feel good about influencing you in return and giving something back in return.
Interestingly, it's heavily skewed to, I guess, professional elements, career history and experience, academic achievements, training and credentials, both.
Yep.
Well over 50%. And then hobbies and interests is next at 25.
So, and this is an example of a very simple question that is, you know, kind of obvious in what it would be. And most people, because of the content that we're covering and the context that we're in, you might think, yeah, like that's, you know, sort of assumed. But what's really interesting to me from this kind of question is the fact that there are, in fact, more than a quarter that are actually interested in hobbies and interests, which on the surface you'd think have absolutely nothing to do with what we're here to discuss and what it's all about. And yet the learning for me is that, well, 28% of you actually have an interest in that to some extent. Well, and maybe more than that, because some of the 20% that said all of these would apply there as well. So it's not always the obvious answer. You ask the obvious questions perhaps, but sometimes you get less obvious bits and pieces that come back.
I'd be interested in people that did respond that way to chuck in the chat why you are interested in that. Is it sort of, does it help you judge the character of Brenton, and is that important?
The hobbies and interests bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I'm behind time, so I'm going to try and speed it
up. Authenticity, but we'll stop the share and you can chuck it in the chat and we'll keep it going.
Okay. So when it comes to professional media messaging, we want to be concise. We don't want to waffle. We don't want platitudes. We don't want unnecessary mental overhead. A professional message needs to be of low intellectual tax, because it's going to be mostly intellectually heavy anyway. We want to get to the emotional stuff, the emotional vector. We want to change. We want to get to what it means to them relatively quickly. We don't want people being distracted. That means we need clarity. Don't ask them to focus their mind more than necessary to get what you're on about. But still, it's a branding issue. Everything we say in the professional media space is still a branding, still us, still has to be us. And we need to be mindful that there's this whole range of ways in which people can receive it and filter it and interpret it and subjectively judge that we do need to be sensitive to those reactions. So at times, we will need to be extra careful. We will need to be extra restrained. We will need to be particularly cautious in certain topics, right? So, for example, Guy wonderfully passed a couple of very contentious questions to me last week. Remember those? You asked me about Donald Trump and racism. I mean, could we get any more contentious at the moment?
Nope.
All right, so immediately, I need to think, okay, I need to say and express something impactful because it's a big enough issue that I can't just have a watery response to that. But at the same time, I don't want to be taking a particular side or focusing on what I believe and what I'm passionate about, because that's not the right space for that. I'm going to get a large response from people who feel differently or they believe they feel differently. So by being sensitive, you manage to share something, but without crossing the wrong vector too far. So when you get into that conflict space, I want to talk just briefly about where those sorts of conflicts and where that judgment comes from. And this is particularly in the workplace. And the potential for people to disagree, the potential for people to not like what we say or do, to not be happy about it, is always there. But the majority of it comes from failure of some kind of the communications, some kind of misunderstanding, misalignment, or disagreement. Sometimes it's very clear, and we've said or done something and they absolutely don't like it, and they know what it is and we know what it is, and it's very clear, and we always knew that was going to be the case. But sometimes it's simply something's not quite clear, and the only rescue for us then is our communications. But what happens is that the misalignment, and I'll go through these three stages, right? The misalignment is the intellectual stage. This is the point at which people are aware that things aren't to their liking. They're mentally aware that they're not happy about something. But the next stage is where they feel a sense of discord. They feel a discomfort. They feel an emotional change. They are aware of their feelings in the matter. They don't simply aware that it's not right. They're aware that they care about that. And they become aware of their feelings of it. And at some point, they will decide that suffering and enduring those feelings is worth an investment to change that. It's that negative feeling that we are suffering that we want to change. So we invest. It's a threshold, an acceptance threshold that we cross, and we say, I'm going to say something. I'm going to do something. I'm going to reply. I'm going to send a complaint. I'm going to do something because I need to shift my own emotional vector down because I can't deal with it at its current level. I need to invest in some sort of restorative action of some kind. So conflict of any kind is merely a feeling that has been acted upon. Now, when people act upon it, what happens is that we go back to that equilibrium. We go back to the point at which they're no longer willing to act. And sometimes, I'll go back to this also, sometimes what happens is that it gets resolved. We go back to the communications and say, hang on, that's not what I meant. And we clarify and we elaborate and we resolve the misunderstanding such that the reason to be investing in the conflict goes down. Or we raise the price of conflict. And organizations do this a lot, where you have a situation where we know the staff aren't happy. We know people aren't pleased with this new policy, but we're going to change the rules so that in order to complain, it's a much more complicated process. And so they've raised the cost of conflict. Or maybe they say, well, we'll resolve it. We'll give you this much. But if you keep pushing it, we'll go this direction and you really won't like it. So they're doing a little bit of each. They're saying, we'll resolve this little bit, but we're raising the cost of further conflict. And when we as humans get to a point where we reach this new equilibrium, we stop investing. It doesn't mean we're happy. And usually discord will manifest in other ways. It'll manifest in some other form of conflict. It might manifest in something more subtle. With an employee, with a professional environment, people might work against certain agendas. They'll work differently. It'll manifest in their motivation. Or they may leave. They may decide that they can't move the mountain, so they'll leave it. So for us, with our personal brand, with our desire to influence, we remember some of the things we talked about earlier with communication. Remember the rule of reciprocation, how we present ourselves, our disposition, the way in which we communicate, others will be inclined to respond. Remember that the culture of the organization is always going to be more effective, more powerful than policy. If you want to change the way people behave, you have to change the examples, not just the policy. if we get misunderstanding, if we get misrepresentation, only good, clear communications can fix that. Nothing else is actually going to fix it. Some other things will paper over it, but to fix it requires clarity. When we are viewed as clear, articulate, professional people, remember the branding, remember the assumption bit that we talked about a little moment ago? If you come across as a capable communicator, people will assume that you're capable of many things. They'll assume that you're much more effective. They'll assume you're more intellectually capable. They'll assume you're more intelligent, more knowledgeable, more productive. A lot of those assumptions will come out of the way in which you use all of the communications tools, many of which we've talked about over the last few weeks. And they create subconscious influence through that mechanism. So anyone who's a good communicator in the workplace is going to be able to create subconscious influence, which means they're going to be able to have less conflict. They're going to have more influence, more personal brand. They're going to be able to have a bigger impact that's above and beyond what their job title or their raw authority is going to give them. So this is, in a nutshell, leadership. And there's many books written about leadership, but leadership creates followers and followers bring influence. So when many people follow someone, other people will join them simply because others already have. Other people have made the decision that this person is worthy of following. So I'm going to join as well. It might only be one trigger, one single thing that says, oh, this is interesting, but whoa, 5,000 followers, yeah, I'll be in that. It has an effect. Now, I'm aware that I've chewed up a little bit more time. I still have a couple of things to talk about with video recordings because we talked a little bit about this last week. Gaia, there's some questions before we segue off this and talk about recordings. I'm going to put this entire slide up because this is stuff that we talked about last week. Are there questions that we should grab to tie off that last topic before we have a little bit of a chat about video?
Yeah, okay. Varun has asked about gaining influence. A challenge we face, getting them to read the concise message. Thoughts on catering to that or improving that?
Getting people to read the...
Yeah, the importance of having a concise message in order to gain the influence. I suppose that's been covered a little bit earlier on,
so perhaps repetition would be a potential answer to that. There's a phrase that many of us have heard before. When you're communicating with someone, you tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them what you just told them, and then you get them to tell you what you just told them. So the four-pronged approach, and by those 4 steps, maybe they've got it. So repetition is an element. We feel we only need to say it once because we thought it once and we've said it, right? Job done, sent. Not always the case. Often the case, yes, but not always. I repeat myself a lot. Has anyone noticed? Hey, let us know in the chat. Has anyone noticed that I've repeat points, that I say things more than once?
Particularly since you told us.
Now that I'm telling you, you'd be looking for it. But no, going back in your mind. Yeah? So Natasha says yes. Okay, so some do, some don't. Now, here's the point. Those that know, do I repeat myself? Do I make the same point more than once? If you noticed that I did, that means you got it the first time. If you don't notice that I did, that means you didn't get it the first time. And therefore, you didn't feel a sense of mental abrasion that I happened to repeat it and said it again. I wasn't wasting your moment of intellect. And I therefore was still working on your intellectual vector, or you were still working on your intellectual vector, even though I might have said something a second or even third time. And that's probably because your brain was actually really interested in something that I'd said just before that, because it resonated with you. And in that moment, a bit part of your brain was on something else. And so that when I said that other thing the first time, it skipped off the surface and you had to come back to it mentally. And that's part of teaching. That's part of getting your point across. Choose your audience. If you know you're talking to someone or some people that really are likely to get it first time, don't repeat yourself. It's just a tool. It's just something that we go through.
One more question relevant to the last couple of slides, and it is about sort of reiterating something. How do we add meaningful value to others? Have we got any sort of examples we could use?
So two ways that we add meaningful value to others. It all comes back to the vectors, right? So usually it's either intellectual or emotional. Think about it in those terms. The way we add value to others is we help them learn something they didn't know before. And you can gain influence by that, like the informative influence that we talked about. So you add value by expanding their understanding, growing their knowledge. Or you add value by promoting positive emotions or emotions that they value. So you shift them either intellectually because they know something that they didn't, or you shift them emotionally because they had a feeling that they didn't have before and they value. That's why nostalgic things. You talk about the past. People love to get together and talk about the past, not because they want to hear about your past, but because they want to remember theirs. And this is an example of where we add value, even if we don't think that we're adding value. We add value not because of what we give. We add value because of what that causes them to do, think, respond, and how it happens in them. That's where the value happens. It's not what you give, it's how it lands. And that's where you've got to look. So don't assume that because something's valuable to you, it's going to be valuable to them. You want to try and contextually understand where they're at and where they're coming from and what might be of value to them. So that's a really theoretical, functional answer to that question, which is not an example like you were asking for, Guy.
No, that's okay. Examples are hard on the spot. All right, well, let's continue with just the last couple of slides and then we'll have the larger chat.
This is an echo of what we talked about before. And I want to talk about, 3-point lighting. I'm going to do some lighting tricks in here, right? So I'm going to put all this up. Let me talk about the teleprompter. So for those of you who haven't seen it, have a look at the 1 minute, 10-second intro video that I did. I did that using this little gadget. Okay. So this you can buy these for a couple $100, or you can get this one for less than 50 delivery. So this is a teleprompter, right? So that's where the camera goes, but here is where the phone will sit here. So you get an app that you can put your script in, and you can pay $20 for an app that will sit under that. And you put a script in, which you can import from Dropbox or anything else, and have that mirrored so that it'll appear on the glass. And because of the split lens of the glass, right, you can read here what's reflected and the camera looks right through it.
Hey, Brenton, sorry to interrupt. Is it possible for you to stop sharing your screen and then we'll be able to see your picture bigger?
Yeah, okay. Let's do that.
And all this time, I thought you were just bloody off the cuff.
That better?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so see the reflective bit? You can see my keyboard now in the reflection. That's because it's reflecting here. So this is where the phone would sit, and it's a split lens, but what the camera sees does not see any of that. And this lets you look straight at. Now, I'll tell you something though. With this in here, right, you can narrow the margins, and I narrowed it down to here. And if you really look for it, and now you will, if you really look for it, you can see my eyes just doing this a tiny bit. And it's so noticeable that if you have your script full width of the teleprompter, you'll really be doing this, just that much width. So you narrow the margins down. Now, there's other apps that you can get, still $20, $30, that will allow you to have the script here, right next to the camera, and you read it at the point it goes past the camera. So even if you don't have a teleprompter and you don't have anything else, you could just have your phone with the $30 app, and you can do a fully script-driven eye contact recording right through, and send that to your customers, send that to your colleagues, send that to a particular staff person that you want to say, or a particular colleague that you want to give a personal message to, send it to friends and family, and have a much greater digital impact in the way you do it, simply by using the tools correctly. Now, you can, of course, ad lib. You can just make it up, but maybe you want to be a little bit more controlled and careful about how you say it. That's how a teleprompter, that's the device. That's how the process works. And if you don't want to get a device, that's fine. And you can use things like this. So you can actually put something like this back here. So there's this attachment, you can put your phone behind it and just use the phone, a phone camera. You don't need any expensive gadgets. I just used the same webcam and screwed it on the back when I did it. So that's the teleprompter message. Let me talk to you a bit about lighting. All right, so right now in this room, in this scene, there are 10 sources of light, 10. I'm going to start turning them off and I'm going to show you what difference they make. 10 includes the monitor, right? So yes, and the monitor is a source of light. So I've got a large monitor. If I want to reduce that source of light, I just close all the white screen windows when I've got a dark background, but that's also a source of light. So what I've got, and I think I showed you this before, right? So I showed you these, did I? I did show you these, didn't I?
Yeah.
So I've got two of them, one either side so that I get rid of shadows. I'm going to turn them off.
Well, that's huge.
Right. I've still got a forked thing up here, so I'm going to turn that off. Now, what I've also got, and I'm going to show you, I'm going to turn this to show you, that light up there is illuminating the wall. Now, why am I illuminating the wall? Because if I don't, that light there, which I have a piece of cardboard in front of to try and block it, you'll see already, now that I'm in shadow and darkness, that's now got a nimbus of light around it. That's glowing. Remember what happened last week? Remember we saw that last week? It was much more bright. I haven't changed the light. I've got my headphones off now, so I can't hear you, Guy.
Oh, now we can say anything we like about him. I should probably say the 11th light source is Brenton himself.
That's what happens when I change that light. Now, there's a couple of other lights that I want to talk to you about.
Oh, I hate dead air. Come on, Brent. This is very interesting.
That light was hidden behind the monitor and it was just illuminating the Buddha statue, the teaching Buddha, because if I don't, you see that's now gotten dark. But you can all now notice that there's a light down here, right? So what that light's doing is illuminating the dark bookshelf. I still have the ceiling light in the top of the room. That's on. I'm not going to turn that off because we'll plunge into darkness. There's one more light. That's the light I didn't have on, which I've now turned on. And that's the light that's illuminating the statue of the Greek goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom. So you can see what's changed. I'm going to turn these ones back on.
And I can't go past Wendy's chat. You can't hear me, can you, Benton? Damn.
Couple more.
Oh, I've missed you.
Right.
I have to stop you because we've got some excellent chat stuff going on. Wendy's my favorite. Good, he's got pants on. So well done, you.
Only today.
The things I've seen with Brenton.
Right. So that was an interlude. So a couple of things about the lighting. That entire lighting setup, every light that I just turned on and off, total budget, less than $200 for all of them.
Wow.
Mail order, Lazada, Amazon, you name it, those sort of things. Yeah, so these circle lights, $20 each. So you really just need one of these, because if you get one of these, right, it's got this in it, and this is a great way for you to put your phone here, and that's a bit bright. I mean, these things, you can change their brightness. And I can change their tone. Warmth.
Which is how you control reflections in glasses and things.
Exactly. So you see my little reflections here. So I often leave them off. Like I didn't have these on when I was doing I had the teleprompter was big enough font that I could read it.
Super interesting. That was great.
So that's what 10 lights delivers. I think I've turned them all back on. I think I have. So, and you can see now that I've pointed that out and I've turned off a few things here, that you can now identify that, yeah, okay, I can see now what's been illuminated. You don't need to do all that. But if you were going to make the effort to produce a video that was for large consumption for customers, for a large number of staff, something that was going to live on in a training manual for a long period of time, if you were going to write a letter that was going to live, or a document that was going to live in perpetuity and meant to guide the organization, you'd probably check your grammar. You'd probably check your spelling. This is the same. It's affordable. And yes, setting all of this up today took me 10 minutes. Setting it up the first time took half an hour or more because it was trial and error. Where do I actually need the lights? But once you know where to put them and you've got that figured out, it's a few minutes to set it all up, plug it all in, turn it on. That's not much different to what we would normally do with a text medium or with other, like the effort we put into a slide deck. Goodness, the amount of time that the average professional often puts into a slide deck. If you're going to do a video, put that level of effort in as well. Get yourself a teleprompter or just use the phone. I don't know if I can actually... That's it. All right, so you can see it's inverted. It's just starting again. And you can, that's the script.
And right, it goes at a set pace?
Well, it depends on the app. I set the pace. I decided I wanted to be done over 1:20.
Mm-hmm.
And then it showed me on the slider bar what that pace was. And then I could adjust that and speed it up, slow it down a little bit if I wanted to. So I played around with it till I got it right. I did a trial. I read it aloud to myself with a stopwatch. That's 1:20. Okay, so I set that. That's good. I like that pace. So you can control all of that with these sort of apps. And that's the one that's meant to go under the teleprompter. There's others that have video recording built in as part of the app. In fact, I think that one does. And the script literally appears, and it's like the selfie image with your picture in it, and the script running in text over the top of you.
Wow.
So easy to do.
And you can also get your own, everyone has their own sort of words per minute count just naturally. So you can prepare that and know what yours is and write according to it.
And you can write it directly on the phone in the app, or you can import it from anything, that your phone has access to. So there's free versions of these apps, but you pay the $20, $30 or whatever it is, and get the full featured version, and get a couple of them if you want. They're really quite cheap as a business tool. It costs less than a mouse and keyboard, right? So pretty effective.
Really cool.
All right.
Should we chuck the slides back up, or have you still got some more very exciting demonstrations?
Slides, and this is stuff I talked about last week, so we don't need to revisit it. We did cover off this last week. There are some good links that have been put up there in the topic notes as well that will help you with editing, etc. So one thing I want to point out is something called a jump cut. A jump cut is where you have your video recording and you cut out all of the boring bits. And you've all seen this on YouTube, where someone's talking and then suddenly they're here, and they it's just the next sentence. And you think, hang on, they just moved. But we're now seeing it so often that it doesn't bother us anymore. Go back 10 years and most television producers that'd be a sackable offense if anyone did that. But today in YouTube, you can get a 6-minute waffle down to a 3-minute punchy conversation. That 3 minutes is worth it. 3.5 minutes is meant to be the ideal length of the average YouTube video. You've only got 10 seconds to get them their point. So you have to help within 10 seconds. They have to decide whether or not they're going to watch the rest of your video. That's all you've got to get them hooked. That is the last slide.
Alrighty.
So
we should probably talk about the exam.
Yeah, let's do that. And then see what other questions we've got.
Yep. And thanks for sticking with us, folks. I hope you've had as much fun watching along as I have. Right. So as we were saying, the course exam will be available in a few days. We've just got to put some QA through it. There's a hurdle requirement that you complete the quizzes for each module before accessing the exam. And they're 40 multiple choice questions, basically about basically using the content from the webinars, but there'll also be a few questions about from the other materials, like the lecture recordings and
the audio.
And if you really want to excel in the exam, you'll need to go through everything. Make sure you do your preparation. Whilst it is open book, you do only have an hour to do it, and you do only have one attempt at it. So make sure you do the preparation. And then we're going to announce shortly after launching the exam, Brenton's Podoko stuff. And Brenton, do you want to have a bit more of an in-depth chat about that for now?
So the Podoko scenario should go up shortly after the exam. It'll be accessible next week. If you've already signed up, you'll get an email telling you that, hey, the scenario is ready. It's something that we are looking to use and roll out on a much larger scale. It is not meant to be something that specifically teaches you stuff. It's meant to be experiential. It's meant to be something that you get to learn and do and see and think and reflect, contemplate how you made these decisions, but not individual decisions. It's not about that one thing that happened. It's about looking at the trends. It's about looking at the reports that say, well, across these 50 decisions, I scored pretty well in clarity, but I scored pretty well in being concise. These aren't questions that are going to ask you for grammar and spelling and language. These are questions something like a colleague says something about an email that they didn't read, and you then you've got a couple of questions you can ask them, and you can say, well, okay, I'm going to do this about it. I'm going to resend the email, or I'm going to call them instead. And everything you do has trade-offs, and there's no right or wrong answer. So it's not about, okay, if you know the content, you'll make all the right answers and you'll get a perfect score. It's not that at all. Because life isn't like that. Life isn't going to say, well, if you just did the right thing every time, life would be perfect. No, it's not going to be. So these are scenarios that are meant to give you that sort of, and we've only got a very short one. It's only 50 decisions. So there's about 30 incidents, 2 or 3 situations, and a handful of proactive things you can do. So it's very short. It'll play over 3 days, and it's not non-stop. Things trickle over a few hours at each time something will happen, and the whole thing will be done with probably half an hour of your time spread out over 3 days.
Is the app available on Mac?
Yeah, it's Android and iOS.
Sick.
So you can get it on either, and that's available to download now. So you can download it and register and set up an account. And if you do that, then as this project rolls out and we get more and more scenarios, we will be consistently putting even the scenarios that we build for the university. We'll put small versions, a 50 decision version that will put a lot of them out for free for anyone to use and play and check it out. So there'll be more coming over the next few weeks and months. So you'll get notified if you keep the app, they'll tell you where the new scenarios come along. And we're going to keep putting them out for all of the subjects that we do with IT Masters and Child Sturt. But there's also going to be other things. There's other institutions and entities that we work with, government, etc., healthcare even. So we're hoping that there'll be lots and lots of scenarios that people will be able to play around with and make decisions on. So we've got things like IT services. We've got scenarios to do with things like business analysis, governance, all sorts of things that are corporate, but lots of other stuff as well. So
that's really cool. And just to be clear, there's no requirement to use this in order to pass this short course.
No.
It's just a nice little value add, I think. Bit of fun.
It's all free.
We're testing Brenton's beta, and hopefully if it works really well, we'll start incorporating it into Charles Sturt University postgraduate courses. So that'll be really cool. So yeah, any feedback you have, just please give it back to us. I'm sure it'll be really useful for Brenton and heaps of fun for me, because I haven't used it for about a year with the last short course we did it for. So it'll be heaps of fun. There's a few questions about the exam. There's no sort of due date because these courses are available hopefully for all time. that you don't have to do it by a particular date. So if you're busy at the moment, feel free to take as long as you want. We'll announce when it's up and running, and we'll also give you a weekly reminder for the next couple of weeks just to make sure that you do it, because we find that once you have a few weeks off, you're much less likely to take the exam. But because this course is available for everyone, you can send it to your mates and anyone who you think might benefit from it, because they can go through it at their own pace in the future. The quizzes Mike's asked about, they're in each module on the learn.it masters page. So you can find them pretty quickly. And if you do have any questions, just feel free to chuck an email into the short courses email address. Once enough people have done the exam for us to sort of check everything out again and make sure that the questions are behaving as we anticipated they would and as we hoped they would, and that there's not any questions that are clearly too difficult or perhaps even have the wrong answer put in, we'll fix any issues, and then we'll be able to launch the certificate. For those people that pass the course, you'll be able to download the certificate, and that's that's in the examination section of the course page. You can go and have a look at that then. The link to Padoka will be announced in an email, and we'll also put the link into the short course. Alrighty, so let's see what else we got about the details. That's about it, so that's good. And then the last thing you can do is give us some feedback on this course as well, and complete the course satisfaction survey. It really helps us, I guess, improve these short courses, or at least know where our shortcomings are, and assess whether we've got the budget to fix it.
It really is helpful.
They're free short courses, so we do sort of operate on the smell of an oily rag, but which is part of why I'm so grateful for people like Brenton to give up so much of their time for doing it. It's really nice. If maybe we could just whip through the last questions, and Hannah, if you can cut off any questions that come after Adedoyin's, sorry. We'll go from the top, if that's okay with you, Brenton.
Yep.
Beauty. I should have asked that beforehand. Bashir asks, what is the benefit of personal branding?
So one of the things we talked about before is the judgment factor. And people will judge and make assumptions about us. And when they have a clear and accurate understanding of who and what we are and how we think and how we operate, and we are consistent about that, that consistency is our personal brand. So that consistency is our controlled brand. The effect of it is their reaction to us. So people will react to us based on all of that collective data and what it adds up to. And what it adds up to is our personal brand, which is what people know about us or think about us before and even without having encountered us face to face. And even when they do encounter us, like we work with them, we see them every day. Our personal brand is what they believe to be true about us that is above and beyond the specific facts that they know for absolute certainty. So they know with certainty exactly how we speak and think about something in particular because we had the conversation. But for everything else, they're going to make a judgment about based on our personal brand. So personal brand is another way of describing personality expectations. What people expect from us because of our personality, that translates to personal branding online.
Thank you. Asim asks, if a hacker misuses your LinkedIn account, how should you go about regaining your credibility or dealing with it?
Well, the first thing is get control of that account back again. And you might need to go through various processes with LinkedIn to do that. That's an absolute must. Once you've done that, and I'm assuming that when you do that, you're going to have problems where people have found something different in your message stream. Now, if they've used it in a way that's very, very subtle, then it's different. And if they turned around and completely changed it and made it an advert for some bizarre thing, the more bizarre and the more different from you it is, the easier it is for you to simply come back and carry on where you were and maybe put a note that says, yeah, my account was hacked. Apologies for that. bit of noise and it might not be terribly difficult or awkward. But if they've been far more subtle about it and they've tried to damage your brand by doing and saying things that really aren't you, then you might want to start at the top with this account has been recovered, and then a paragraph or two that says, yes, my account was taken over by someone. A lot of things were done and said that were perhaps untruthful, malicious, and that it's all been fixed and corrected. What you find here is the real me. And that kind of message might be necessary for a time, but it's not going to be necessary for very long. So you think about your audience, how many people are going to come to your LinkedIn site? Those people that you might have affected your content, you might put a message out to them and say, hey, I got hacked. My account was compromised. I fixed it. Apologies if anything happened or you received stuff. So you go through that PR exercise. You might have a note at the top that corrects you. You might even not do that. You might just send a message out. Because what you don't want to do is necessarily let everyone new that's yet to come across you and see that. You don't necessarily want to have that as an advertisement that, hey, you had this problem, when they're not going to notice. So you keep that to a very limited window, or you just use a broadcast. But you definitely have to go through a PR exercise to address whatever was incorrect about your brand and correct it. Most people will give you a fair amount of sympathy, though, because this kind of thing can happen to anybody.
It's loaded question time. Or at least just really complex question. Joe asks, how do you define yourself, be the real you and relate to others without creating the wrong first impressions for your audience on LinkedIn, for example, if your demographic or background or even opinion is deemed not part of current societal norms you might agree with some norms, but not others. You might be subject to ageism. You might be part of a historically privileged demographic that maybe should be a little bit more quiet and give room for others now.
So working within the confines of human nature and what Joe is talking about, the challenges that Joe is talking about come from human nature. These are not challenges that we can say, well, people they just shouldn't think like that. They will. These challenges are real and they will continue to be real. So the way in which I would suggest you try to deal with that is to break down the barriers slowly by working within the confines of how influence takes place, knowing that people will extrapolate small pieces of information and they will draw assumptions out of that to a much larger extent. Means that at the beginning of your branding in that environment where there are those sorts of challenges, you don't try to move either the intellectual or emotional vector very far in the beginning. Because what you want to avoid in the beginning is that subjective, unfiltered, assumptive, preconceived reaction that comes in and says, aha, Brenton said that thing. I now know everything I need to know about him and I'm not happy about it. Tune him out, marginalize him, lessen his voice because he said something that shifted one of my vectors more than I thought he had the right to. He hasn't earned that right to influence me. Now, we know this from psychology because we know that there's heaps of studies and examples that have happened where you get people that are huge cultural opposition that can somehow find a way to have a personal friendship with someone who is on a diametrically opposite, or, the kind of person that they would simplistically vilify. And yet it's possible for them to rationalize a friendship with that person. And that's because of the way the mind creates these sort of exceptions and relationships in our head. So if you're in that sort of challenging environment, don't try to over-educate them in a rush. Don't try to make them feel very much at the beginning. Start small, because the more you accumulate under the radar that they have seen and heard and haven't had a strong reaction to, they will start to get familiar with this feeling that says, this person's kind of like me. I feel kind of like that, or I don't feel opposed to that. So as you start to then push the vectors a little bit further, you'll have a license to do so that will come from the history you've established. And it comes from your personal brand that has taken time, because your brand is more at odds with their preconceived ideas than it might be in another circumstance. So that's what you're dealing with. That's the way you need to tackle it. Go slower and move things a little more gently. And you'll still get the influence in the end, but it'll just take a bit longer.
Awesome. Thank you. DP asks, are we headed to a point where both social and professional tools will merge into a single engagement platform? How would we then separate the emotional versus intellectual profiles?
I think that could happen. And I think the answer is circles. I do think that if it were to happen, it would only succeed, like in terms of adoption and users, if it properly allowed for us to have circles where we could share certain things in a certain circle, in a certain group, with very good controls and restrictions, far better than we have today. So if those developments and innovations took place as part of the platform that merged, then it would work. If it didn't, the platform would not succeed. It would not get enough people on it because of that very problem that DP is talking about. It would be too difficult to navigate. And this is one of the reasons why Facebook is changing in a certain direction, why LinkedIn is changing in certain directions, and all these other new ideas are coming up because they're trying to solve these kinds of problems. So yeah, it might happen, but we'll only be talking about it because they've done it well.
Thank you. Term I'm not particularly familiar with. How can one control brand demarketing? Have you heard of that one before?
No, I have not really. I've not really tackled demarketing. So I'm going to make an assumption. As long as someone wants to put a definition in the chat for me about what.
We can wait for that, and then we'll go to the next question.
Or maybe if they're still on, they can elaborate a little bit for us in the chat. Let's go to the Than's question.
Than's, what is a good way to encourage passive members in a social friend group?
So passive members. Well, firstly, we need to separate the difference between encouragement and opportunity. So if people are passive in a social group, what we always want to be able to do is give them an opportunity to be more active. We want to create a space, we want to create the environment, we want to create the potential for them to do so. But encouragement isn't always appropriate because sometimes they're very happy not contributing. They're very happy just lurking in the background. They may be there because what they need is to hear the voices, to hear the noise, to be a consumer and to be a passive occupant of the space. So a little bit of encouragement might be appropriate until we learn whether or not they're there to find a way. If they're looking to find their voice, then yeah, encouragement might be a way to do it. How would we do that? You need to find out what their uniqueness is. What's their thing? What's their special moment? What's their special idea? Give them something that can be part of their brand. So the way to do it is you want to give them an opportunity to brand something. It could just be a post. It could be a single statement. It could be a single thing in a WhatsApp chat group, but it's theirs and it represents them. And that's what will bring them forward. That's what will give them encouragement. And if they're looking for a way forward, that's the feeling that will help them. Being comfortable that says, I put this out there, it's me, and it was well received, and maybe I'll do it again. So if that's how we want them to participate, make sure you give them the space. And you can talk to someone and talk about something that is very strong within them, that they feel good and confident. Ask them a question. Ask them about something that they did, something that they're good at, something that they've had success in, something that they might feel good to talk about. Change the topic. Make it about that thing. Give them the space. And if they don't take much of that chance and they back away again, well, maybe then that's all they need.
Thank you. 2 questions left. And we've got some information on Adedoyan's question, but we'll go for that one last. Anne asks, isn't sometimes 30 influencers equal to 3,000 in terms of followings and followers?
So the leveraging force in and of itself, it really depends. If you have 30 influencers, I'm thinking of the context of this question, and I'm going to again make an assumption about the context. If you have 30 influencers, if those 30 influencers are followers of yours, then they will then influence other people themselves. So absolutely, if you can influence a conversation, if you can start a conversation, if you can change a conversation, this is where you get the phenomenon of saying, well, there's a conversation and there's lots of voices and someone's saying, yeah, I agree to that and I agree with that and I agree with that. The I agree gets lost in the noise. But the one that says, well, yeah, but what about this and what about that and what about something else, then they are molding and evolving the conversation, and that significance gets remembered. So that will then influence what happens next. So in a similar way, if you are speaking to people and you have influences in that conversation and you speak to those influences and you speak to things that they are likely to chime in on, be passionate about, contribute, and they do, then everyone who's following them will see, hear, notice, and they will see them responding to you. This is especially common in places like Twitter. When someone else sees them responding to you, your brand power is exposed and increased as part of that process. So absolutely, you can get an exponential influence, but that's tricky. That's targeting at the influences that you have within your audience. It definitely works, but it's quite challenging to do. That's an art.
Okay, and back to the final question, how can one control brands demarketing? Thank you, Jagan, for sending in a definition. Demarketing, the use of advertising to decrease demand for a product that is in short supply.
Okay, so I'm guessing that in that context, that what Jagan is talking about, it's done knowingly and deliberately.
So your brand is maybe out of control or too big for you to manage.
Well, I'm thinking,
let's take the example of. Oh, okay.
What if a competitor uses demarketing to reduce demand for something you do, and maybe only you do? Yeah. And social media and social influence media would be an ideal way to do that, to promote conversations that say, well, we don't do it that way anymore. That's not the way to do it. So you don't need that thing. Do it a different way, and you don't need that thing anymore. So we are reducing. So that's marketing warfare. That's simply a who can control the message, who can control the narrative, who can control the conversation. The only way to address that is to weigh in, to be part of those conversations, to do what I just mentioned before and come in with an alternative viewpoint that says, well, but what about this, this, and this? Create the alternative narrative, create the different mindset, and work against it. Work against it deliberately, work against it not just in your conversations. It's not just about over here, you're saying, oh, we should do it this way, building up demand, whilst over here, they're saying, no, it's not the thing anymore. You got to get over into that conversation, join it, and influence it. Go back to the very source of that conversation and work on it. And you won't win 100%, but you've got to be fighting it on two fronts.
Alrighty, thank you very much. That sort of reminds me of the clear Pepsis and the clear Coke marketing battle from the early 90s. Deliberately releasing very poor soft drinks. Have a look for that one, folks.
Right, okay.
Yeah, sort of to trash someone else's version of it. Okay.
I'm saying that demarketing is politics by definition, and I think there's a valid point there. It is politics. It was partisan politics, for sure.
Yeah. Everyone look up Crystal Pepsi if you're interested in that story, by the way. All right, well, final question from the final webinar. Thanks so much, everyone, for sending them in and for your keen interest in the chat and for sticking around for all of these webinars, each of which ran long, for which I'm very grateful because it's a free resource which you can all sort of look at for the rest of your lives if necessary. Thank you heaps, Hannah, for sticking around for the webinars and for looking out for everyone in the chat and the course page. And of course, thank you so much, Brent, and I'll leave it to you to sign off and send us off into the night.
And thank you everyone for all of the questions, the chat, all of the conversations, for all of the things that you've all contributed in the forum posts. I've been reading all of those. It's been fantastic. It makes this whole thing alive, and we really value that. And we will definitely read every bit of feedback. Please fill in the surveys. Do come along for the next short course, whenever that is. We'll love to see you again there. And until then, that's all from us for now. Thank you and good night.